Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where you come when you need, well, the full picture, the intellectual roadmap for subjects maybe you thought you had pinned down.
And today, we're looking at something fascinating.
Mhm.
The huge resurgence in the study of, well, what we broadly call shamanism.
Yeah, it's a big topic. Our mission is really to map out how academic focus shifted, especially since the 1990s. It went from being seen almost as a historical relic to, well, this intense area of research.
It really is a remarkable turnaround. For a long time, the field felt a bit static, but our sources are clear. Starting around, say, 1992, things just took off.
Right.
And this isn't some quiet, dusty academic trend. We're talking a major shift. It's become multifaceted, much better funded. You see it in the journals, new university presses focusing on it, and just this massive explosion online.
Okay, so the sources we're diving into, they seem to identify four main currents here. It's not just one thing anymore.
Precisely. It's fractured in a productive way. We're tracking four main paths, really. First, there's this huge swing towards what's called particularized ethnography.
Focusing on the specifics.
Exactly. Really drilling down into local practices. And that's why scholars now often use the plural, shamanisms. It's a deliberate move.
Makes sense. What's the second?
Second, a much-needed focus on historical and politicized approaches. This includes, importantly, some really sharp critiques of the word shamanism itself, how it's been used, what baggage it carries.
Okay, history and politics, got it. Third.
Third, we see the rise of transcendent and cognitive science models. These are actually trying to find maybe new kinds of universals, but from a different angle. Brain science, cognitive frameworks.
Interesting. Sort of circling back, but with new tools. And the last one.
And number four, a huge area, is the study of Neoshamanism, the modern, often Western, globalized movement that draws on these ideas.
Okay, quite a map. Let's unpack this. And I think we have to start where the sources suggest the biggest correction happened, this move away from the idea of one single universal shaman.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, the field was just dominated by these huge, sweeping theories. Mircea Eliade's work was incredibly influential.
His archaic technique of ecstasy, right?
That's the one. He presented shamanism as this single, timeless thing, almost outside of culture or history, a kind of monolithic concept.
And the modern research basically says, nope.
Pretty much. That synthetic, one-size-fits-all idea is what contemporary research largely rejects. It's seen as, well, overly simplistic and missing the crucial local details.
So instead of looking for the shaman, researchers are deliberately saying shamanisms, plural. You mentioned that. It feels like a statement.
It is. It's an intellectual and, frankly, a political signal. The message is we need to focus on the local, the detailed, the specific experiences of individual practitioners in their unique cultural and historical moments.
Right. And that means digging into specific places. Where has this focus been strongest?
Well, there's been an impressive amount of really detailed culture-specific ethnography, especially coming out of Asia. The sources point to collaborative work as being particularly valuable.
Like the Daur Mongol study.
Exactly. The work by Caroline Humphrey with her Daur collaborator, Ercan Canan. It provides such an intimate perspective that you just don't get from generalizations. And Laurel Kendall's study of a single Korean woman's initiation, that kind of deep case study, shows the richness you find when you move away from broad strokes.
And this isn't just an Asian focus, right? The Americas, too.
Oh, absolutely. Ongoing work in both North and South America. You see studies like Ana Mariela Basigalupo's work in Chile on Mapuche Machi shamans. She looks at how their traditions are adapting, even exploring things like gender transgression within the practice. It's very specific.
Fascinating.
And you also get these really focused studies asking very particular questions, looking deeply into Huichol peyote rituals in Mexico, for example. Or, on the other side, research into practices involving aggression or sorcery, like Canaima in Amazonia.
Canaima. That sounds intense.
It is. And importantly, that research often connects these practices directly to the really complex, often violent history of colonialism and its aftermath. It's not just about spirits, it's about power and history.
So this drive for specifics, for the particular, it seems like it's branching out into all these different subfields. It's not just the journey anymore. Like healing, how has the approach to shamanic healing changed?
That's a great example. The shift has been pretty profound. Historically, some scholars were quite skeptical, maybe saw practitioners as, well, charlatans.
Right, the efficacy question.
Exactly. But modern research, especially coming out of medical anthropology, has largely moved past that kind of skepticism.
Mm.
The focus now isn't on whether it works in a biomedical sense, but how it functions as a socially negotiated process.
So looking for the mechanisms.
Precisely. Asking how a therapeutic effect might be achieved. Is it symbolic healing? Is it the power of social bonding in the ritual? Maybe endorphin release from chanting or dancing? Or emotional catharsis?
Hmm.
It's a much more pragmatic look at the psychological and even physiological factors involved.
That pragmatism seems to carry over into studies of music and narrative, too.
It does. Ethnomusicology has become a really important subfield. Music is so often central to inducing altered states.
Yeah.
So research, like Marina Roseman's work on the Timur people in Malaysia, looks not just at the musical structures, but how music making adapts, especially when communities face huge cultural changes. And the psychological effects they study? Well, they often parallel the cognitive science findings we'll get to later.
And narrative, storytelling.
Also growing. Studies on Nepalese shamanic oratory, or looking at contemporary narratives emerging in post-Soviet Siberia, often linking these stories directly to cultural revitalization efforts.
It feels like every piece of the practice is getting its own dedicated focus. What about the objects, the material culture?
Yes, that too. From, say, Tlingit shamanic kits on the northwest coast of North America to intricate Huichol yarn paintings in Mexico. These objects are getting serious attention.
But that brings up tricky issues, doesn't it? Like displaying sacred items.
Huge issues. There's a lot of important work on the ethics of displaying Native American shamanic art, for instance. And critically, this ties into the growing movement for the repatriation of sacred objects, things like the efforts by the Omaha people to get their sacred items back from museums. It's deeply political and cultural.
And speaking of specific materials, entheogens, the psychoactive plants.
Ah, yes. That remains a major focus, maybe unsurprisingly. Substances like ayahuasca, traditionally used in Amazonian practices, get a lot of attention, partly because of traditional use, but also because it's crossed over significantly into Neoshamanism.
And this is where the local meets the global in potentially problematic ways.
Exactly. Here's where that hyper-specific research suddenly connects to these big, sometimes messy global dynamics. When a plant like ayahuasca gains massive popularity in the West.
It becomes a commodity.
Precisifierly. A traditional ritual element can morph into a lucrative cash crop.
Right.
And that huge external demand can have really disruptive, sometimes devastating economic and social impacts on the indigenous communities who were the original stewards of these plants. It links shamanism directly to globalization, market forces, state control over resources. It gets complicated fast.
Okay, let's pause here for a second, because you've outlined this massive shift towards the particular, rejecting the big universal theories.
Right, that was the initial corrective impulse.
But it sounds like, paradoxically, by focusing so intensely on the specifics across many different cultures, the role of music, the methods of healing, the use of certain plants, researchers almost started to see common patterns emerge again.
That is the great irony, isn't it? The whole mission began by insisting on difference, on rejecting Eliade's monolithic shaman. Yet in documenting all these specific details, the importance of achieving an altered state, the centrality of music, the focus on healing, you inadvertently start to see, well, potential common threads. It raises the question, are there some underlying mechanisms or functions that do operate cross-culturally, even if the expression is unique?
So the rejection of the universal kind of led back to a search for universals, but maybe different ones.
In a way, yes. Or at least it opened the door for new ways of thinking about cross-cultural similarities.
Yeah.
And that really pushes us toward the next major area, looking at shamanism through the lenses of history, politics, and critique.
Okay, so moving into that historical and politicized realm, how are scholars using these ethnographic insights to look backward in time?
Well, historical and archaeological approaches used to be rarer, but they're definitely increasing. Scholars are trying to apply what we've learned from living traditions to understand past contexts.
Like looking for shamanic elements in ancient societies.
Exactly. People are examining possible shamanic practices among, say, Viking Age Scandinavians or in ancient Greek contexts, or looking again at the historical records for Sami and Finnish traditions.
And archaeology. That sounds contentious. Interpreting rock art, for example.
Oh, it can be very contentious. There's significant work, like Lewis Williams' interpretations of sand rock art in southern Africa, suggesting depictions represent shamans, spirit helpers, or visions from trance states.
But not everyone buys that interpretation.
Definitely not. This methodology often sparks vigorous, sometimes quite heated debate. It bumps up against earlier archaeological traditions that were strongly materialist and, frankly, skeptical about assigning religious or trance-based meanings to artifacts without concrete proof. It's a fundamental disagreement about evidence and interpretation.
Moving from ancient history to more recent times, you mentioned the political dimension, shamans as symbols of resistance.
Absolutely. Very often, shamans and their traditions became focal points for indigenous resistance against colonial powers or assimilationist state policies.
So the relationship with the state is often fraught.
Extremely. State attitudes vary wildly. Sometimes suppression, sometimes co-option, sometimes neglect. Think about Siberia, the Tsarist Empire, then Soviet suppression, and now complex revitalization efforts in places like Tuva. The state is never a neutral observer when it comes to alternative sources of power or cosmology.
You see similar dynamics elsewhere.
Sure. Korea's history shows shifting state attitudes toward shamanic practices, often linked to modernization drives or nationalism. There are examples, too, like an Ojibwe community stigmatizing a missionary, showing resistance at a local level. It's always political.
And within this political context, you get revitalization movements, indigenous groups actively trying to bring back traditions.
Yes, these are often powerful statements of cultural identity and resilience. The Omaha efforts we mentioned earlier to repatriate sacred objects and revitalize the ceremonies around them, that's a perfect example. It's about reclaiming history and identity.
This focus on history, politics, and power seems to lead naturally to the most critical approach. You mentioned the one that questions the term shamanism itself.
Right, what the sources call the rhetorical approach. This is where scholars turn the analytical lens back onto academia itself. They examine how shamanism developed as a scholarly category, a Western concept, maybe even a metaphor.
So the argument is that the term itself might be part of the problem.
That's the core of it. They're essentially asking, is shamanism a real thing out there in the world, a cohesive set of practices? Or is it more of an intellectual box created by Western observers? At its sharpest, this critique argues that generalizing diverse spiritual traditions under this single label is, perhaps unconsciously, a form of Western intellectual bias, maybe even a subtle racism. Well, the argument goes, it denies the complexity and uniqueness of each tradition, reducing them to a kind of simplistic unity. And this constructed unity then serves as a convenient other, to contrast with supposedly more complex Western religions like Christianity or Judaism. It simplifies the primitive to elevate the civilized.
That's a strong charge. Does this critique also look at other biases in past scholarship?
Yes, definitely. It involves deconstructing damaging older concepts like the pseudo-medical diagnosis of Arctic hysteria, showing how it pathologized indigenous experiences. And very importantly, scholars like Barbara Tedlock have highlighted how earlier research often marginalized or completely ignored female practitioners, imposing a male-centric view.
So it's a call for academia to examine its own assumptions and language.
Exactly. It's a crucial step acknowledging that the tools and terms we use to study something shape our understanding of it, sometimes in problematic ways.
Okay, so that critique pushed hard for particularity. But then you said we swing back towards looking for universals again, this time through cognitive science.
Right. This is the third major trend. While some comparative scholars still look for commonalities, suggesting ancient diffusion or shared origins, the real momentum is with the cognitive science of religion, or CSR.
And CSR is okay with cross-cultural models.
Yes, because its foundation isn't shared history or cultural borrowing. It's shared biology, the human brain.
So the idea is that certain experiences are rooted in how our brains are wired.
Precisely. Leading figures like Michael Winkelmann argue that altered states of consciousness, often central to shamanic practice, are basically products of universal human neurobiology, our brain architecture.
So if the brain works similarly everywhere,
Then techniques that reliably trigger certain neurological states,
yeah,
deep trance, visions, ecstatic experiences, are likely to arise independently in different cultures. You don't need direct historical contact to explain the similarities.
shamanism then becomes a kind of test case.
An ideal test case, as the sources put it, for exploring that interaction between brain, mind, culture, and religious experience. It's a powerful new framework.
Which brings us to the final and maybe most publicly visible area, Neoshamanism.
Yes, the modern phenomenon. Neo-shamanism generally describes attempts, mostly happening in the West but now global, to revive, recreate, or adapt shamanic-like practices.
But these aren't usually direct continuations of ancient traditions.
Often not. They tend to be more improvised, maybe developed in workshops. Anthropologist Michael Harner's core shamanism workshops were very influential here, and they explicitly draw inspiration from the ethnographic literature we've been discussing.
So academia itself fuels the movement it studies.
There's definitely a feedback loop. And philosophically, you can trace Neo-Shamanism's roots back to those romantic or nostalgic feelings in earlier anthropology, that longing for something seen as more natural, spiritual, or connected than modern Western life.
But this is where things get really contentious, right? The appropriation issue.
Hugely contentious. It's crucial to acknowledge the strong critique from many indigenous groups, particularly in North America. The term plastic shamans emerged from this.
What does that term signify?
It's used to criticize practitioners, often non-indigenous, perceived as taking sacred traditions out of context, commercializing them, or practicing without proper training or community accountability, essentially, co-opting indigenous spirituality.
Is the movement responding to that critique at all?
There are signs of it. One interesting trend is the rise of what some call ethno-neo-shamanisms. These are movements trying to reconnect with specific historical traditions from their own perceived ancestry people, exploring potential Celtic, Sami, Germanic, even Jewish shamanic roots, often using those historical reconstructions we talked about. It might be, in part, an attempt to find a perceived legitimacy outside of borrowing from living indigenous cultures.
And where does neo-shamanism fit in today's world?
It's deeply woven into the modern landscape. You see it strongly connected to the self-help and personal growth movements. It fuels spiritual tourism, think ayahuasca retreats in the Amazon. And of course, it has a massive online presence, global organizations, portals, forums. It's fully part of the contemporary globalized spiritual marketplace.
Wow. Okay, so pulling all these threads together after this deep dive, the study of shamanism isn't simple anymore, is it?
Not at all. The last couple of decades have brought incredible nuance, but also incredible complexity. The scholarly task now involves understanding these specific spiritual lives in relation to everything: ancient traditions, colonial histories, state power, global economics, cognitive science, online communities. It's a lot.
So what's the big takeaway for someone trying to make sense of this? It feels like the study itself has changed fundamentally.
I think that's right. These shifts in studying shamanism really reflect broader changes in how we study religion and culture overall. There's this productive but sometimes uncomfortable blurring of lines.
What lines?
The lines between the supposed objective outside observer, the scholar, and the subjective participant or practitioner. The field is much more self-aware about the scholar's own position and influence. It forces you, the listener, to constantly think about the frame. So, maybe the final thought is this. When you encounter the word shamanism today, or read about these practices, what lens are you using? Are you looking for that universal human experience maybe rooted in our brains? Or are you focusing on the unique, culture-specific story often tied up in politics and history? What part of this complex picture stands out most to you?
A lot to think about there. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the tangled, evolving world of shamanism studies. We'll talk to you next time.